In the heart of a brutal winter where survival meant everything, a solitary man built a cabin that was mocked by his peers. It was small, simple, like a monastery cell, they said. But in the freezing cold of the Rocky Mountains, it would prove that size didn't matter when it came to keeping warmth. His invention would turn the wilderness upside down, showing the world that sometimes the simplest designs were the most powerful. Before we dive into this incredible story of innovation and survival, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love seeing underdog stories that defy expectations, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because next time we'll uncover another forgotten tale from the frontier that will leave you speechless. Samuel Bridger stood outside his newly built cabin, staring at the pristine blanket of snow that covered the land. The air was frigid, biting at his face like sharp needles. Around him, the other trappers, rugged men hardened by years in the wilderness, gathered in small groups, their laughter carrying over the howling wind. They were talking about him, as they always did. "Look at that," one of them said, pointing at the cabin with a sneer. "A man spends all his time building a house that looks like a monk's cell. What a waste." Another man chuckled, his voice thick with mockery. "He'll freeze to death in that little thing, no better than a fox den." Samuel's cabin was undeniably small. It was built of stone and wood, a humble structure that had taken months to construct. But its modesty was part of the point. It was designed for warmth, not grandeur. Still, the mocking voices of his peers stung. They had never understood his obsession with isolation and efficiency. To them, the wilderness was a place to conquer, not to outsmart. Samuel had heard all the jokes before. They called it Bridger's Monastery or the prison cell in whispered tones when he wasn't around, but the more they laughed, the more determined he became. They didn't see what he saw. The real challenge wasn't just surviving the wilderness, it was thriving in it. He had grown up hearing stories of the mountain men, men who would make their homes in the harshest environments and fight against nature's every turn. But what struck him most was how many of them died early, lost to the cold, disease, or the unforgiving wildlife. The trapper's life was dangerous, but it was also short. Samuel wasn't just building a cabin. He was building a future, one that would last, one that would protect him from the grizzly bears that roamed these lands, testing every weakness of the old log cabins with ruthless precision. The cabin had one purpose: survival. And despite the mockery, Samuel knew he had created something no one else could match. As the first snowstorm of the season rolled in, Samuel sealed himself inside his new cabin, the door creaking shut behind him. He could hear the wind, battering the stone walls, howling like a wolf, but inside it was warm. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and for the first time in weeks, Samuel allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. It wasn't much, this cabin. It was small, cramped even, but it was his. It was perfect for one man, just enough space for him to sleep, work, and stay alive. The simple design of the cabin, combined with the thick stone walls and the sturdy wooden roof, created an airtight seal that kept the cold at bay. Where other trappers would have to feed their fires for hours to maintain warmth, Samuel's fire was small and efficient. The heat, trapped within the walls, radiated and stayed. But while Samuel was warm inside, the world outside was unforgiving. The snow piled up quickly, covering the landscape in an endless sea of white. Each gust of wind seemed to strip away the heat from the world, leaving nothing but freezing, desolate silence. Every day, Samuel went out to check his traps, working through the cold with a calm persistence that was becoming familiar to him. When he returned, his breath fogged the air in front of him, and he could feel the weight of the snow settling around him. His hands, calloused from years of work, moved quickly as he unloaded the day's catch, his breath shallow and steady. He had learned early on that time in the wilderness wasn't measured by the hours, but by the changing of the seasons, the survival of each day. Even as the fire in the hearth flickered low, He felt the satisfaction of knowing that no matter what the world threw at him, his cabin would keep him safe. His thoughts often drifted back to the other trappers and their dismissive words. How long before they came knocking, seeking refuge from the storm? He knew it wouldn't take long, and when they did, when they saw how the cabin could hold warmth with so little, they would understand. They would finally see the value of what he had built. But by then, it would be too late. Samuel had built his cabin not just to survive, but to endure. And when the others came, he would be ready to show them that the true strength of a man wasn't in how much space he had, but in how he used the space he was given. Days turned into weeks, and as winter deepened, the silence of the mountain wilderness began to feel more profound. The kind of silence that gnaws at the mind. Samuel had been alone for months now, the only sounds in his life the crackling of the fire, the howling of the wind, and the occasional rustle of an animal in the snow. The stillness was both peaceful and unsettling. It wasn't just the silence of isolation that troubled him, it was the weight of it, the knowledge that with every passing day the world outside the cabin remained as unforgiving as ever. The trappers who had laughed at his design weren't around anymore. They had either moved on or fallen to the brutal winter, swallowed up by the unforgiving terrain, their cabins torn apart by grizzly, or collapsing under the weight of snow. But Samuel had built his home to withstand the elements. His little stone cabin, now covered in snow, stood like a fortress in the mountains, impervious to the ravages of nature. It was more than just a shelter. It had become his sanctuary. The small size, which once brought ridicule, now seemed like the perfect defense against the isolation and harsh weather. It was easy to forget the pain of mockery when the warmth inside wrapped around him like a protective blanket. Still, there were moments when the quiet became unbearable. Samuel found himself pacing the cabin, his boots scraping against the stone floor. He had no distractions, no company, save for the animals that dared wander too close to his home. The only sound was the occasional creaking of the cabin as it settled into the earth, the weight of snow pressing against the walls. The world outside was cold, indifferent, and vast. A reminder that, for all his ingenuity, he could never escape the wilderness entirely. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Samuel stood by the small window, looking out at the snow-capped peaks. He had built his cabin to survive, but he had not anticipated how much survival would cost. He missed the sounds of human life, the chatter of fellow trappers, the stories shared around a fire, the camaraderie that came from living in such a harsh environment. The reality of loneliness began to sink in. Despite the warmth of his cabin, there were days when the isolation felt more suffocating than the cold itself. He had built this cabin for one reason: to survive. But now that survival was no longer in question, he was forced to confront something deeper, the human need for connection. The long winter nights were a reminder that no matter how strong his cabin was, no matter how insulated he felt, the battle for his own sanity was something he would have to fight alone. One afternoon, as the wind picked up and the snow began to fall harder, Samuel noticed movement on the horizon. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, the shadow of trees bending in the wind. But no, this time it was real. There, in the distance, a figure appeared, barely visible through the curtain of snow. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. A visitor. But who could it be? The man stumbled toward the cabin, barely able to keep his balance in the fierce storm. His coat was torn, and his face was covered in frost, his movement slow and labored. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before rushing to the door, grabbing the rifle by his side, and stepping out into the storm. His cabin was safe from the outside world, but in moments like this, he had learned that the wilderness was unforgiving, even to those who weren't prepared. "Who's there?" Samuel called out, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. The man didn't respond immediately. He was too far away to hear clearly, and the storm swallowed the sound of his footsteps. But after what seemed like an eternity, the stranger reached the door. Samuel lowered the rifle, his caution mixing with a strange sense of relief. The man was a trapper, his face weathered and worn, his eyes desperate. "I need shelter," the man rasped, barely able to speak over the cold. "I've lost my way. My camp. It's gone." Samuel stepped aside, motioning for the man to come in. "You're safe now. Get inside." The stranger staggered into the warmth of the cabin, his body trembling from the cold. He collapsed by the hearth, his hands shaking as he tried to warm them by the fire. Samuel moved quickly, offering him a blanket and a mug of hot tea, grateful that his cabin had been built to withstand the storm. The small space that had once seemed so cramped now felt just right. There was no wasted room, no unnecessary space. It was a perfect shelter built for moments like this. The stranger, still shivering, took the tea gratefully. "I didn't think anyone lived out here. Thought I'd freeze to death before I found another cabin." Samuel nodded, settling onto a chair opposite him. "Not many make it out this far. I've been here for months. No company, no visitors. The storm's been relentless." The stranger looked around the cabin, his eyes widening as he took in the solid stone walls, the warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. "This place, it's incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like it. How did you build this? No one I know would have thought to build something this strong." Samuel shrugged. Just had to survive. Had to build something that would last. The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering back to the door and the howling storm outside. "I can see that. But what about everyone else? What about the others? I thought no one lived this far out." Samuel paused, looking at the man, the question weighing on him. "Most have moved on. A lot didn't make it. There's a lot of dead men in these mountains." The stranger nodded grimly, staring into the fire. "I thought I'd end up one of them." As the night wore on and the storm raged outside, the two men shared stories of their travels, of the hardships they had faced, and of the moments that had nearly broken them. But in that small cabin, under the protection of the stone walls and the warmth of the fire, they found something they hadn't expected. A brief moment of human connection. And as the storm howled outside, Samuel knew that his cabin, once a source of ridicule, had now become something far more important. It was a sanctuary, a refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn. The days grew colder, and the storm that had been brewing for weeks finally descended upon the wilderness with full force. By the time the snow had blanketed the land, the world outside Samuel's cabin was a frozen wasteland. The wind howled with an intensity that seemed to scream through the cracks in the stone walls, testing the resilience of every building in its path. For the first time in months, Samuel began to feel doubt creeping into his mind. The cabin had been built for storms like this, of course. The stone and wood structure, reinforced by the carefully designed foundation, was meant to withstand the worst nature could throw at it. But still, the fury of the storm pushed him to the brink of his own fears. He had seen the wilderness tear men apart before, seen cabins torn apart by relentless winds and collapsing under the weight of snow. It was one thing to build something that worked on paper, and another to test it in the face of nature's might. For me, as Samuel had watched the storm through the small window of his cabin, unable to shake the feeling that he was in the eye of something far greater than his construction. The snow piled up around the cabin, reaching halfway up the stone walls. The wind rattled the roof, and every now and then the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow accumulating on top. Inside, the fire burned brightly in the hearth, providing warmth that seeped into every corner of the small cabin. He spent his days huddled by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside, constantly aware of the dangerous quiet that followed each gust of wind. The cabin was holding strong, but Samuel couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. What if something gave way? What if he had misjudged the power of the storm? It wasn't until the third night of the storm that his fears were realized. The wind picked up again, louder than before, and it seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. The walls creaked and groaned, and the fire flickered in the hearth. For a moment, Samuel thought the roof might collapse under the weight of the snow. He grabbed his rifle, his breath shallow and fast, prepared for the worst. But when he stepped outside, he was met with a sight that filled him with a cold dread. The entire cabin was buried beneath several feet of snow. The wind had created a massive snowdrift that now enveloped the structure, leaving only the chimney exposed. Samuel's heart sank. If the wind had been a bit stronger, if the snow had fallen a bit heavier, his cabin might have been lost. He dug around the cabin with frantic urgency, clearing the snow from the roof and walls, checking for damage. To his surprise, the cabin stood strong. The stone walls, though buried, had held. The roof had bent under the pressure, but it had not collapsed. Samuel breathed a sigh of relief, his body trembling from the cold and the intensity of the moment. The cabin had passed its first true test. It had endured, and it would endure again. He returned to the warmth of the fire, his mind racing with a new sense of respect for the strength of his creation. The storm had shown him just how fragile human survival was, but it had also proven that his cabin was something different, something that would stand the test of time. The winds would howl again, the snow would fall, but Samuel had built more than just a shelter. He had built a fortress. As the storm finally began to wane, a strange calm settled over the land. The wind's fury subsided, and the snow slowed to a light flurry, leaving the wilderness glistening in a blanket of white. Samuel stood outside his cabin, surveying the landscape. The world felt eerily still, as if nature herself had paused to take a breath. For the first time in days, the mountains were visible again. Towering peaks blanketed in snow, the jagged ridges casting long shadows over the valley below. The storm had tested everything, but now there was a sense of peace. Samuel's cabin stood resolute against the elements, its stone walls and sturdy construction proving their worth. He hadn't expected the storm to be so relentless, but now that it had passed, he felt a deep satisfaction. He had done it, his creation had held, and he had survived. As the snow continued to fall softly around him, Samuel was reminded of the isolation that came with living this far out in the wilderness. The trappers who had once mocked him were long gone, and his cabin was the only one for miles. There was a strange solitude to his life now, a solitude that was both comforting and unsettling. It wasn't long before his thoughts returned to the stranger he had helped during the storm. The man had been gone for days, venturing off into the wilderness again to return to his camp. Samuel had seen him off in the morning, the man's step slow and heavy as he disappeared into the white horizon. He had told Samuel that he would make his way back to the rest of the trapping community, but Samuel knew that many of the others would never find their way out here, let alone seek shelter in a place like his. But now, with the storm behind him, Samuel couldn't help but feel the urge to reach out, to not remain completely isolated. Perhaps it was the reminder of the fragility of life that had been drilled into him by the storm, or maybe it was the simple human need for companionship. Either way, he knew he couldn't continue living this way forever. The next day, Samuel took a small bundle of furs and supplies, packing them carefully into his bag. He decided to visit the nearby trapping community, something he had not done in months. He didn't expect much, but the gesture felt important. He wasn't just bringing supplies, he was bringing the knowledge of how his cabin had survived the storm. And perhaps, just perhaps, the others would finally see the value of his design. The trip was not an easy one. The snow was deep, and the journey took several days. But Samuel made the trek. His thoughts focused on what he would say when he reached the others. Would they mock him still? Or had the storm proved something? By the time he arrived, exhausted but determined, Samuel knew that no matter the reception, he had something to offer. His cabin had withstood the storm, and perhaps it was time for others to see that what he had built was more than just a shelter. It was a new way to survive, one that could protect them all. The sun was low on the horizon when Samuel finally made it to the small, scattered community of trappers. The storm had passed, but the aftermath remained. Drifts of snow piled high against cabins, trees bent under the weight of the ice, and the world still seemed to hold its breath. Samuel, carrying his pack of furs and supplies, trudged through the deep snow toward the nearest cabin, his boots sinking with each step. As he approached, he saw familiar faces through the window, gathered around the hearth, their voices low and full of laughter. It felt strange to him, hearing the sounds of other people after so much solitude. He had built his life on the quiet rhythm of the wilderness, where survival came not from conversation, but from silent, steady effort. Yet here there was a hum of activity, a sense of camaraderie and community that he hadn't realized he had been missing. When he knocked on the door, the laughter inside abruptly ceased. A moment passed, and then the door creaked open. The trapper who answered was a man named William Marshall, a tall, grizzled veteran of the mountains. His face was weathered, his eyes wary but curious. Samuel stood there, his pack slung over one shoulder, the cold air swirling around them. "I was passing through," Samuel said quietly. "Thought I'd stop by, bring some furs and supplies. The storm made sure we all stayed put for a while, didn't it?" William's eyes flickered to the pack, then to Samuel's face, sizing him up. "The storm? That's the least of it," he muttered, stepping aside. "Come in. It's too cold to stand out here." Inside, the warmth hit Samuel like a wave. The fire crackled in the hearth, the scent of roasting meat and brewing coffee filling the air. Around the room, a handful of other trappers sat, staring at Samuel as he entered, their expressions unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you so soon," William said as Samuel placed his pack on the floor. "I thought you were holed up in your little stone cabin, hiding from the cold." Samuel forced a smile, but the sting of the comment cut deeper than he had anticipated. He hadn't expected a warm welcome, but there was something in the tone that felt dismissive, as if his solitude had somehow been seen as cowardice, or worse, foolishness. He knew that his cabin, the one he had spent months building with his own hands, had been a source of mockery among the others. But now, standing here in this room, surrounded by men who had survived countless winters, the doubts crept in. Had he really built something worth sharing, or had he just been another fool, chasing an impossible dream? As he set the furs down on the table, he couldn't help but notice the raised eyebrows and the hushed voices. It was as if they were waiting for him to speak, to explain himself, to justify why he had spent so much time on something so small, so seemingly insignificant. "So what brings you to our neck of the woods?" one of the other trappers asked, his tone neutral but edged with curiosity. Samuel hesitated for a moment. This was it, the moment to show them that his cabin, his design, had withstood the worst that nature could throw at it. But as the words formed in his mind, he found himself uncertain. Was it pride or practicality that made him so sure of his creation? Was it really the best solution, or just the result of a man trying to hold on to something he could control? He cleared his throat. "The storm. It made me realize something. I've been living alone out there for months, and that cabin of mine, it's more than just a shelter. It's a refuge. It's built to last." The men exchanged looks, their faces unreadable. Samuel couldn't tell if they were intrigued or just humoring him. "And what makes it so special?" William asked, his voice gruff, but with a hint of genuine curiosity. Samuel hesitated, the weight of his doubts pressing down on him. He had always believed in the strength of his cabin, in its ability to stand firm against the wilds of the frontier. But now, surrounded by men who had spent years in the wilderness, he couldn't help but question whether his creation was truly enough to earn their respect. The next morning, after a long night of uneasy sleep, Samuel stood outside the cabin, watching the last remnants of the storm scatter across the mountains. He had barely slept, his mind spinning with questions about what he had shared with the men the night before. They hadn't laughed at him, but they hadn't exactly embraced him either. It was as if they were waiting for something more, waiting for him to prove that his cabin was more than just a well-built structure. William had invited him to stay for a few days, and Samuel had accepted, knowing that he couldn't return to his cabin without answers. If he was to live in the wilderness alongside others, he needed to know whether they saw him as an outsider or an equal. As he walked toward the hearth in the center of the cabin, he found the men gathered around a map, discussing their next move. There was a sense of urgency in their voices, a quiet tension that reminded Samuel of the weight of the wilderness, always testing, always waiting for the smallest mistake. "Well, Bridger," William said, looking up as Samuel entered, "you said your cabin could handle a storm, but you've never faced a real test. We've got work to do. Some of the other trappers are stranded up by the high ridge. We need to get to them, but the way's blocked by snow. You willing to help us out?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. This was the test. If his cabin had truly earned its worth, then the real test would come from something more than just the wind and snow. It would come from these men, from their willingness to trust him, to see if he had something of value to offer. He nodded slowly, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling in his chest. "I'm in. Whatever you need, I'll do it." William studied him for a moment, as if measuring his sincerity. Then, without a word, he motioned for Samuel to join them by the fire. "I'll make sure your cabin holds up, Samuel," William said, his tone softening for the first time. "But you'll have to prove it to the others out there. Actions speak louder than words." For the first time since arriving, Samuel felt something akin to respect from these men. The wilderness was a harsh judge, but here, among the trappers, Samuel realized that the true test wasn't in building a shelter. It was in building trust. And for the first time, he felt as though he might just be ready to pass it. The wind had picked up again by the time Samuel joined the group, and the snow was falling in thick, wet flakes. The air was damp and biting, and the promise of a clear sky seemed far out of reach. Samuel adjusted his pack and checked his rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. This was no ordinary journey. They were headed into the heart of the wilderness, where the storm had made travel treacherous, and where the men who had ventured before them had not yet returned. William and the others moved ahead, cutting through the snow-covered path with practiced ease. Samuel followed behind, trying to keep up. His cabin had kept him safe, but the vastness of the wilderness outside its walls was a reminder that survival out here was never guaranteed. The men had been cautious when he first arrived, but now, after his words the night before, they seemed to have softened. Perhaps they had begun to see him as more than just a solitary man with an odd little cabin. Yet Samuel knew that this journey would decide everything. His cabin had withstood the storm, but now it was time for him to prove that he had the skills to survive in the wild alongside these seasoned men. He wasn't sure if it was his cabin that had earned their respect or the quiet resolve in his eyes, but either way, he was here to show that he belonged. As they trudged along the snow-filled trail, the ridge loomed ahead, dark and unforgiving. The path leading up to it was blocked with snowdrifts that were deep and treacherous, and the tracks of previous travelers had been completely buried by the storm. The journey would be slow and hard, but Samuel could see the determination in William's eyes. They weren't about to turn back now. "We'll make it through," William said, his voice low and firm. He turned to Samuel, his face covered in a thin layer of frost. "Your cabin might have withstood the storm, but this mountain, it tests every man who walks its paths. You ready to face it?" Samuel nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "Ready." The climb was exhausting. Every step Samuel took seemed to sink deeper into the snow, the weight of the drifts making progress painfully slow. His legs burned, his lungs strained for air, but he kept moving, determined not to be the one to slow them down. They couldn't afford to waste time. The trapped trappers were out there somewhere, and they needed help before the storm took another life. As they approached the base of the ridge, the trees grew sparse, and the wind howled even louder, battering them with icy gusts. The ground here was uneven, the snow unevenly compacted by the storm. Samuel's heart beat faster as the cold bit deeper, but he kept his eyes fixed on the ridge. The men moved steadily ahead, their faces determined, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the hardest challenge of his life. "We'll find them," William called over his shoulder, his voice steady. "We'll make it through this." The ridge rose in front of them, its silhouette dark against the gray sky. The trail grew steeper, more perilous with each step. As they climbed, Samuel's thoughts drifted back to his cabin, back to the warmth and the safety he had built with his own hands. Out here, he was just another man trying to survive. But with each step, he grew more certain of one thing, that his place in this wilderness was just as solid as the foundation of his cabin. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was earning his place among these men. By the time they reached the ridge, the cold had become unbearable. The wind whipped through the trees, howling with such ferocity that it seemed as if the mountains themselves were alive, testing them with every step. Samuel's hands were numb, his fingers stiff from the chill, yet despite the biting cold, he couldn't ignore the urgency of the situation. There were lives at risk. At the summit of the ridge, they found signs of the trapped men. Their campfire had been abandoned, the logs barely smoldering under the fresh layer of snow. Tracks led off into the dense forest below, where the trappers had apparently tried to make their way out, but they hadn't gotten far. "They're close," William muttered, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "We just need to find them before the storm gets any worse." Samuel's mind raced as he surveyed the trail. It wasn't just the storm they had to contend with. The mountain was a dangerous beast of its own. The thick trees, the steep cliffs, the unpredictable terrain, this was the real test. He wasn't just navigating through snowdrifts anymore. He was navigating through the wilderness itself, a place that could either offer protection or become a tomb. "Spread out," William ordered, his voice cutting through the air. "We're looking for fresh signs, something to tell us where they've gone." Samuel nodded and moved off to the side, stepping carefully to avoid the deeper patches of snow. He was determined not to let the others down. His cabin might have stood firm against the storm, but here in the wilderness, he was just another man fighting against the odds. Yet something in him told him that if he could find these men, if he could lead them to safety, then maybe, just maybe, he would prove to the others that he had more than just a sturdy cabin. The cold seeped through him, and as his breath came in ragged gasps, he scanned the trees once more. Finally, he saw it. A set of fresh tracks, the footprints of men struggling through the snow. The trail was faint, but there was no mistaking it. These were the trappers they were searching for. He turned back to the others, his eyes lighting up with determination. "This way," he called out. "I found them." William and the others quickly joined him, their faces grim but hopeful. The storm was closing in around them, but Samuel's heart was steady. He knew the wilderness, he knew the struggle, and he knew that this time it wasn't just about surviving, it was about leading the way. And for the first time, Samuel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, not just as a builder of cabins, but as a part of something bigger. The wind howled as the group of trappers trudged deeper into the forest. Samuel led the way, his eyes scanning the snow-covered ground for any sign of the missing men. The snow had fallen heavily overnight, erasing most of the tracks, but the faint impressions left by the trappers' boots were still visible, barely discernible beneath the blanket of white. Samuel's breath came in short bursts, his lungs burning with the effort of navigating through the deep snow. The cold had sunk into his bones, but his focus never wavered. The men they were looking for were out there, and every second counted. William and the others moved in a loose formation behind him, their faces grim and resolute. Samuel could see the worry in their eyes, but there was something else too, a quiet trust that had begun to form between them. They had seen his cabin withstand the storm, and now they were relying on him to guide them through the wilds. After hours of navigating through the thick woods, Samuel finally came to a stop. He crouched down, pressing his gloved hand into the snow. The tracks were still faint, but they were there, leading off toward a narrow pass between two steep ridges. The trees had thinned, and the wind had picked up again, driving snowflakes into their faces like shards of glass. Samuel looked back at the others, his face hard with determination. "We're close," he said, his voice low and steady. "They came this way. We need to move fast." William nodded, his eyes scanning the ridge ahead. "We'll find them, Samuel. We've come this far. There's no turning back now." The path became more difficult as they ascended the ridge. The snow was deep and the air thinner as they climbed higher. Samuel felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him, but he ignored it, focusing only on the trail. Every step he took, every crunch of his boots in the snow, was another step toward saving the men who were depending on them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel spotted something through the trees, a faint flicker of movement. He motioned for the others to stop and crouch low. His heart raced as he moved closer, his rifle ready, though he hoped they wouldn't need to use it. As he drew nearer, he saw what it was. A small camp, barely more than a smoldering fire, and some hastily built shelter made from branches. But there were no men in sight. "Damn," William muttered under his breath. "They must have gone further up the ridge." Samuel's heart sank, but he didn't let the despair show. He could still feel the faint traces of their presence in the snow, their steps leading toward the higher ground. They were close, too close to turn back now. "Let's move," Samuel urged. "They're not far. We can't stop yet." With renewed determination, the group pressed on, pushing higher into the mountains, each step taking them closer to the missing trappers. But as they ascended, the storm intensified, and the wind grew fiercer, making it harder to hear anything above the roar of nature's fury. Samuel's resolve was unshakable. He had seen too much loss in the wilderness to turn away from a man in need. Hours passed, and the cold seemed to cut deeper with each step. The storm had fully engulfed them now, the wind howling with an almost malicious force, carrying snowflakes so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Samuel's muscles ached with fatigue, and his breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to keep pace with the others. His thoughts were focused solely on the tracks, the faint prints that led them onward, disappearing into the endless expanse of white. They were no longer following simple paths or identifiable signs. The trail was becoming harder to read as the snow and wind obscured the ground. Samuel, however, trusted his instincts more than anything else. He had lived in these mountains long enough to understand their rhythm, the way the land could hide its secrets, and reveal them only to those who truly paid attention. His mind sharpened with every step, his senses alert to every change in the wind, the pattern of the snow, and the distant sounds of the wilderness. "Over here," one of the men called from the front, breaking the silence. Samuel's heart leapt as he turned toward the voice. There, through the veil of snow, he saw the shape of a man, or at least what looked like a man, half buried in the snow, his form partially obscured by the harsh winds. The group moved quickly toward the figure, Samuel's heart racing. He pushed past the men, his legs burning with each step as he reached the fallen trapper. The man was covered in snow, his clothes torn and weathered from the storm. Samuel knelt beside him, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. There was no movement at first. For a moment Samuel's heart stopped, but then a faint cough broke the silence, and the man's eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. "God," William muttered, his voice filled with both relief and horror. "We thought you were dead." The trapper blinked, struggling to focus on their faces. His lips were cracked, his face pale and gaunt from hunger and exposure. I thought I was done for," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But you found me." Samuel felt a surge of relief flood through him, though it was tempered by the gravity of the situation. They were running out of time. The storm had trapped them all, and they still hadn't found the others. The trapper in front of him was weak, barely able to sit up, and the storm showed no sign of easing. They had to move quickly. "We're getting you out of here," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "We'll get you back to the cabin. Hold on." With the help of the others, they carefully lifted the injured man and began the slow trek back toward the shelter of the cabin. The journey was perilous, each step a battle against the storm's relentless fury. But Samuel knew they couldn't stop now. They had found one man, and that spark of hope was enough to keep them moving forward. As they trudged back, Samuel felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him, but his resolve remained firm. He would find the others. He would not let the wilderness claim them without a fight. They had made it this far, and he would not stop until everyone was safe. The descent was slow and harrowing. The injured trapper's weight was shared between Samuel and another man, while William led the way with eyes sharp for danger. The storm showed no mercy. Snow blinded their sight, and wind battered their bodies with a force that seemed determined to rip them from the mountain entirely. But step by step, they moved. Not fast, not steady, but moving, and in weather like this, that was a victory. Samuel's shoulders ached from carrying the man's arm around his neck. The cold crept in beneath his layers, gnawing at his fingers and toes, yet he barely noticed. His focus was fixed on one image, his cabin, the stone walls rising like a monument to stubbornness and survival. The thick wooden door, the clay-sealed logs, the fire he had left smoldering before he departed, all of it waited ahead like a promise, if they could just reach it. He glanced down at the injured man whose breathing was shallow. The cold had done a number on him. His skin was pale, and his words came in gasps and groans, but he was holding on, barely. "How much farther?" one of the men asked, panting, his beard frozen with white. "Less than a mile," Samuel replied. "The land dips soon. After that it's flat. Cabins at the rise before the trees." The others didn't respond, but their pace didn't falter. The knowledge of shelter ahead gave them a grim kind of energy, a reason to keep going. When they finally reached the flatland, Samuel spotted the shape of his cabin, small, almost insignificant under the weight of the storm, but to him it looked like salvation. Smoke still curled from the chimney, faint but steady. He had left enough fuel on the fire, and the insulation had done the rest. The warmth inside would hold. As they approached the door, Samuel kicked the snow from the threshold and shouldered it open. A gust of warm air greeted them, a small welcome mercy in the frozen world. One by one the men entered, carefully carrying the injured trapper inside and laying him near the fire. Samuel moved quickly, feeding the flames and setting a kettle to boil. Blankets were retrieved from shelves, hot tea prepared, boots set by the door to dry. The others sat in stunned silence, taking in the cabin's interior, the thick walls, the sealed joints, the solid roof, the warmth, not a draft to be found, not a drop of moisture on the floor. William looked around slowly, his eyes resting on Samuel. "I'll be damned," he said. They all laughed. "But you built it right." Samuel didn't answer. He just kept tending to the fire, the injured man, and the growing silence in the room. Respect didn't need to be spoken. It filled the space like heat. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that cabin, they were safe. That night, no one said much. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows along the thick stone walls. The injured trapper lay bundled in blankets, color slowly returning to his cheeks. The rest of the men sat close to the fire, sipping tea or chewing dried meat in silence, their bodies recovering from the brutal descent. For the first time, Samuel's cabin held more than just himself. The space, which had once been mocked as cramped and monastic, now felt perfect. Every inch served a purpose. The raised sleeping platform now doubled as a resting space for the weak. The hooks on the walls held wet gear in orderly lines. The heat from the fire filled the room entirely. No cold corners, no wasted warmth. Samuel watched as the others took it in. Their glances drifted to the thick door and its iron hinges, the shuttered window, the handmade joinery of the furniture. One of them ran his hand along the clay-sealed wall, inspecting the resin blend that held the logs together. "This stuff, it doesn't crack?" the man asked quietly. "No," Samuel said. horsehair and pine resin. Flexible. Stays sealed even when the wood shifts. The man nodded slowly, as if the idea was foreign to him. It's solid and warm. I've never been in a trapper's cabin that holds heat like this. Samuel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The cabin spoke for itself. Every detail was visible, not in a grand way, but in the quiet confidence of craftsmanship that had been tested and had passed. The irony was clear to everyone. The very thing they had mocked was now the thing keeping them alive. William leaned back, exhaling slowly. We should have listened. Hell, I should have listened. We all build big because we think we need space, but we end up cold, patching leaks, fixing collapsed corners every year. This is different. Samuel stirred the pot hanging above the fire. Smaller space means less to heat. Thicker walls, fewer gaps. Tight corners reinforced with pins, not just notches. Everything has to work together. He looked around at them. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just didn't want to freeze. One of the younger men, a wiry trapper named Elias, glanced at the door. You think it could keep a bear out? Samuel met his gaze. Already has. More than once. Elias let out a low whistle. I believe it. The cabin fell quiet again. Outside, the wind howled and snow battered the roof. But inside, the silence felt earned, not empty, but full of thought. Later that night, as the fire burned low and the men drifted into sleep, Samuel lay awake on his cot. The soft breathing of the others filled the space, and he realized something unexpected. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. His cabin, once a solitary cell, had become a sanctuary, and the walls remembered. The days after the storm passed were marked by a slow return to normalcy. The men who had taken refuge in Samuel's cabin had recovered, and the pressure of the search had finally lifted. They had found the missing trapper, and while there were still others scattered across the wilderness, there was a deep sense of relief that no one had perished in the storm. But Samuel could not settle into comfort. The mountains still called to him, an unspoken pull that urged him to venture back into the wilderness, to face the elements and the challenges that lay beyond the safe walls of the cabin. He had built the cabin to endure, to protect him. But the wilderness wasn't finished with him yet. His cabin had saved lives, but Samuel knew it was only one part of the story. The true test would come when he ventured beyond the walls he had so carefully crafted, when he returned to the forest and valleys, to the places that had tested him in the past. He couldn't stay locked away forever. He needed to know that he could still survive on his terms, beyond the shelter of his creation. One morning he woke before dawn, the fire barely a whisper of warmth in the hearth. His breath fogged the air as he sat up, quietly taking stock of his surroundings. The others still slept soundly in the small space, their bodies tucked in beneath thick blankets. Samuel watched them for a moment, each of them secure, safe, and warm. All because of what he had built. And for a moment he felt a surge of pride, but it was fleeting. He rose and moved quietly through the cabin, making sure the fire was stoked. Then he turned his attention to the door. The small cabin, with its solid structure and clever engineering, had served its purpose. But it could not be the center of his world forever. He needed to feel the mountain again. He needed to test the wild and reclaim what he had lost in his obsession with shelter. As he slipped through the door and into the still, cold morning, a rush of wind greeted him. The mountain stood quiet, as if waiting for his return. Snowflakes drifted in the air, and the ground was still soft beneath his boots. It felt familiar, but different. The wilderness had changed. It was no longer the fearsome unknown. Samuel knew it now. He had learned its language. He paused at the edge of the trees, staring out at the endless expanse before him. His rifle was slung across his back, his pack filled with supplies for the journey ahead. He had made his decision. He would spend the next few days hunting, scouting, re-establishing his place in this world. The others would likely stay behind, recuperating. But Samuel didn't need them. He had built his cabin, had made it a place that could keep them all safe. But this was his journey. He was a man of the mountains, not just of the cabin. He set off into the wild, his steps sure and steady, each one a reminder of the man he had become. The land would test him once more, but Samuel was ready. His cabin had prepared him for this. And now he would see if he could endure the wild once again, without the walls he had so carefully constructed. Days passed as Samuel ventured deeper into the mountain wilderness. The cabin was a distant memory now, only a small speck on the horizon as he moved further from its warmth and safety. He had lived alone before, but this felt different. The storm, the search for the missing trappers, and the refuge he had offered them had shifted something inside him. He was no longer just a solitary man in the wild. He was part of something larger, a community of men who had found respect in his ingenuity, even if they hadn't fully understood it until it had saved their lives. But as Samuel pressed forward, he felt the weight of that responsibility. The wilderness could be brutal, and despite all he had learned, it would always test him. His skills, his resolve, and the cabin he had built, they were just tools in an endless struggle. The mountain was vast, indifferent, and alive in ways that no shelter could fully contain. His journey had taken him through valleys and across ridges, the cold biting at his skin, the air thin at higher elevations. He hunted, as he always did, but with a quieter focus. There was no rush now, no urgency. He was testing himself in a way that went beyond survival. It was about something deeper, about reconnecting with the land, with the wildness that had shaped him. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridges, Samuel found himself perched on a rocky outcrop, looking down into a valley where the last remnants of snow lingered around the edges of a stream. The wind had settled, and the world was still. The only sound was the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Samuel felt it, the pull of the wilderness, the call of the wild that had always been there, beneath everything. He had spent so long in the cabin perfecting it, making it a refuge. But now, sitting on that ridge, he realized that the wilderness wasn't just something to be survived. It was something to be embraced. The cabin had been his shield, but now it was time to stand on his own once more. As the last light of the day faded, Samuel took a deep breath, his thoughts clear. He had proven something to the others. He had built something that worked, something that saved lives. But now it was time for him to prove something to himself, that he could survive without the walls he had crafted, that the land still held lessons for him, that his place in the wilderness was more than just a shelter. He stood up, brushing the dust from his clothes, and with one last glance at the valley below, he set off again. The night would soon fall, and he would have to find shelter, but this time it wouldn't be in the safety of his cabin. It would be in the wilderness, under the open sky, where he would stand alone. And he was ready. The days stretched into weeks, and Samuel's solitude deepened. The wilderness was unforgiving, but he had always found solace in its harshness. It had become his home, his teacher, his proving ground. Every morning he woke with the same familiar chill in the air, the distant mountain peaks watching over him like silent guardians. He had learned to read the land, to anticipate its moods and rhythms. Yet, despite his connection with the wild, Samuel couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he had left something unfinished. His cabin, built with care and ingenuity, stood like a forgotten promise in the distance, waiting for him. He had ventured far enough from it now. His journey had been one of rediscovery, testing his endurance, his survival skills, and ultimately his sense of belonging in this vast, untamed world. The land had been kind, showing him the patterns of the seasons, the animals' trails, and the ever-changing landscape. But he felt the pull back to the cabin, a sense of duty and reflection that he couldn't ignore. As the sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, Samuel turned his steps toward home. He knew what he would find: the familiar structure, the solid walls, and the warmth that had kept him alive. But something had changed. The land had shaped him in ways he hadn't expected, making him question what it meant to truly survive. He had built a fortress, but had he built a life? His journey back was slower now. The weight of his thoughts hung heavy, and each step toward the cabin felt more like a return to something deeper, not just a structure, but a part of himself. He had built the cabin for protection, but now he realized it was more than that. It was a symbol of his place in the world. When the cabin finally came into view, Samuel stopped, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp air. The wind had died down, and the mountains were still, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. He walked toward the door, pausing before he entered. The cabin, once a refuge from the wilderness, now felt like a reflection of the journey he had taken. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a man who had lived, who had learned, and who had found his place in the world, both in the wilderness and within himself. Samuel stood in the doorway of his cabin, the soft glow of firelight spilling across the floor, casting long shadows against the walls. He hadn't entered yet. Instead, he paused, taking a long, steadying breath. The journey, both physical and emotional, had been long. The wild had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, pushing him to his limits, but in the end, it had taught him everything he needed to know about himself. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, a steady reminder of the safety and warmth he had worked so hard to build. It was no longer just a shelter. It had become part of him, a symbol of his perseverance, his ingenuity, and his desire to create something lasting. But now, standing outside in the cool air, Samuel understood that the true value of his cabin wasn't in the stone walls or the carefully chinked logs. It was in the moments it had provided: the warmth, the refuge, the connection to something greater than himself. The wild had shown him that survival wasn't just about fighting the elements or building the strongest shelter. It was about understanding the land, respecting its power, and knowing that, no matter how prepared one might be, the wilderness would always have the final say. Samuel had built his fortress, but it was not just to protect himself. It was a place where he could reflect, heal, and reconnect with the lessons of the land. The mountain had given him the tools, but the cabin had given him peace. As Samuel stepped inside, he felt the quiet hum of the cabin embrace him, the fire, the warmth, the solitude. It was all here, just as it always had been. But now there was a new sense of purpose in his heart. He had found something in the wilderness that was far greater than survival. He had found a way to live. And as the night fell around him, he sat by the fire, knowing that his journey was not over. He had built something that would last, a legacy of the mountain, a place that would stand long after he was gone, a testament to the strength of both the land and the man who had learned to call it home.